now we have the opportunity to talk about something hot, hot politics and hot stuff like I'm going to present. Because I'll be talking about neuromodulatory systems, or mostly about the dopaminergic system. But of course, this is in the context of iPad, of our project. So that's why the title, that's why I put the title, Looking for Neuroscience in iPad, right? We did promise on the website, I took it from the website. We do have the sentences saying that we'll try to understand the developing cognition and brain of young adolescents. That's the first paragraph on the website. We also have that we'll use insights from psychological sciences, including developmental and affective neuroscience. So, it's the promise. Of course, I know that there's the logic of the project proposal and the logic of project execution, right? They always differ, but we should try to put these things together. So that's why I was trying to, to talk about stuff that we do propose there. So I'll be talking about the brain mechanism underlying decision-making and risk-taking, because that's also what I do. That's my research area. But I'll also talk about the adolescent brain, because it connects nicely. But also I will talk about, but this will be based on papers by Evelyn Krohn, who is our collaborator in our project, a great professor of developmental neuroscience. And of course, I mean, she's kind of absent from from our meetings, right? But she's there as a kind of figure, a big figure. And the funny thing is that I also overlapped with her in Leiden University not so long ago, but I also never saw her. She was somewhere else, absent. And of course, probably writing all these great papers, right, that we can use now. So I thought I just reconstruct her a little bit through these papers, right? So I talk about several of their findings and how they see adolescence from the perspective of neuroscience. And I think, of course, that the whole talk might be a little bit generic, so to say, but I think it also might prepare us as a whole team to listen about more details from the perspective of neuroscience, right? Okay, so the focus here is on the neuromodulatory systems, as I put it, and particularly on the dopaminergic system. And you'll see why it is important at the very end, I think. But first, before we go to the details of the adolescent brain, we need to understand what we are dealing with about the dopamine. So we need to understand that it's a very old thing. It's a very old molecule. This is the tree of life, of course, the schematic of tree of life, where we have marked groups of animals such as chordata, where we are chordata, the vertebrates belong to chordata and so on. So humans are in chordata. Then there are nematoda, and you can see that the picture there is the Caenorhabditis elegans is the subject of many neurobiological experiments. It's one of nematoda, very simple organisms. And we also have porifera, the sponges living in the sea. So these are very different organisms, right? But they all contain dopamine. You can find dopamine in all of these organisms, right? And so that means, that strongly suggests that there was a common ancestor of these organisms, and that also had this molecule. And that was about 555 million years ago, right? So we are dealing with a thing that's been with us for a very long time during evolution, right? And so these are different animals. And by the way, that picture on the right in the top is the picture of crystallized dopamine. So I put it on the background of the first slide. Okay, so we have very different organisms that do contain this molecule. And so the question is what it does in all of them. And in all of these organisms, dopamine is connected with movement or associated with movement. Either it's movement initiation or some changes in movement. So, but always there, like in Caenorhabditis elegans, when the animal is moving through the environment and encounters a foot patch, then it slows down and starts to make turns. And so that's why that's how it's exploring the environment. Yeah, so it is increasing the chances of encountering another food item. So and then that's when the dopamine the level rises. So it's connected with movement, connected also with reward seeking, right? So this is the, so to say, primary function in the in the animal world of this molecule within context of very different nervous systems. And of course, we are interested in the human brain. And in the human brain, there are several pathways, dopaminergic pathways, which are all relevant to us, to our research, I think. The first one is probably the most well-known, the nigrostriatal pathway, which starts in substantia nigra in the midbrain, and it goes to striatum. Striatum is a very important concept today. It's probably most well known from the context of Parkinson's disease, because the deficiency in that pathway, the deficiency of dopamine in that pathway results in symptoms of Parkinson's disease, like tremor or bradykinesia, so like I would say withholding of movement. Right, so this is a short pathway, but very important for the movement symptoms. The two other pathways that are even more relevant to us, to our research, are the so-called mesolimbic pathway and mesocortical pathway. Sometimes they're treated as one, as a mesocortical limbic pathway. They start in mesencephalon, so also in the midbrain, in the area called ventral tegmental area, and they go to the cortex, to the limbic system, but especially what is relevant to us is the cortex. So the arrow points to the orbitofrontal cortex. That's the cortex right above the eyes, and it will show up later in some relevant research. So you should remember that part. And so the point is here that the systems, the pathways start very somewhere down below in the very old parts of the brain, and they go to the more to the cortex. And this is true of every so-called neuromodulatory system. There are several ones in the human brain: the dopaminergic, noradrenergic, cholinergic, or serotoninergic. And the common feature is that there's some nucleus really, really low, like in the brainstem or mesencephalon, and then it projects very widely to the cortex. And the idea of neuromodulation is that I should remember that these neurotransmitters, dopamine, noradrenaline, they are less than 1% of all neurotransmitters in the human brain, but they have very wide impact because of these widespread projections, right? So what they do is they modulate the neurotransmissions of other transmitters, like glutamate, for example. So a neuromodulator is a neurotransmitter that is released close to a synapse of some other transmitter, and this neuromodulator enhances or inhibits that transmission. So this is the neuromodulation. Yeah, and so we have very little amount of these neuromodulators, but they have very wide impact on the functioning of the brain. And so this is, of course, also true of the dopaminergic system. And so the question is what dopamine does particularly. And here concepts emerge, like relevant concepts emerge, like the reward prediction error. Probably some of you are already familiar. I know that Anna knows this concept well. This is, of course, from neurobiology, but it's now used in neuroeconomics and, of course, in animal studies, because many of these studies are based on animal research. So these results come from rat studies and monkey studies, right? There are three guys who were awarded Brain Prize in 2017, Peter Dayan, Raymond Dolan, and Wolfram Schultz, and they're famous for discovering this phenomena. And so what the reward prediction error is, it's a difference between the expectation and the outcome, so to say, right? Encoded in the level of dopamine. So, you know, when the Christmas is approaching, you see the Christmas tree, right? So this is a cue. You expect that there will be presents, right, under that tree. So there's a cue, and then later there's some outcome, right? And so in a situation, or maybe I should start from another situation. Well, you get a present out of the blue, right? A surprise present, right? So this is a very positive, it's a rewarding thing, right? But you haven't expected that. So that's the first situation, the first line. So when there's no cue, you don't expect anything, but you get something nice, a present. Then we know from this research that there's a release of dopamine, right? So when an animal gets an unexpected reward, then there's an increase in the dopamine level in these pathways that I described. And that's how learning occurs. Animals or humans started associate cues in the environment with that outcome. Yeah, and so what happens is that the dopamine increase happens to the cue, but it starts to decrease in response to the outcome, right? So, you know, when we see the Christmas tree, then the dopamine increases, but later when we get the present, when we know exactly what the present will be, when we kind of can figure it out before, then there is very little or no dopamine response, right? So this is how learning helps us to predict the outcome. And of course, sometimes there is a cue and there is no present under the Christmas tree. And so that's where the dopamine level drops, right? So this is like also, this is where the expectations are not met by the outcome. Okay, so this is the mechanism where dopamine plays a role as a teaching signal in our brain, right? So a very fine-tuned mechanism. But there's also, another role linked to that, of course, because so generally dopamine can be treated as a kind of signal of a reward or expectation of reward. And we know we can track these effects to specific brain parts, like, so I mentioned striatum, and there are parts of dorsal striatum, ventral striatum, and particularly so-called nucleus accumbens is part of ventral striatum, and it has been associated with, with responses to wins, like if we can win or lose $5, $1, or 20 cents. The biggest responses are of nucleus accumbens when we are winning $5, when we are winning, and when it's a relatively large amount of money, right? So you can see that on this graph. And on the left side, there is a graph correlating a subjective feeling of happiness after winning something with the signal change in nucleus accumbens after we win something, right? So there is a match between subjective feeling and brain response in that particular region, and also a match between a financial, like a monetary reward, and that response in that brain part. So nucleus accumbens, ventral striatum. This is what we should remember, and that's on this path, this mesocortical limbic path, right? And of course, you can stimulate that pathway not only by rewards, like external rewards, but you can also stimulate it by drugs. And this is what happens when we give children, like people who have ADHD. We give them, for example, Ritalin or methylphenidate. That's a blocker, so it blocks the reuptake of dopamine in the synapse. So that means it practically increases the level of dopamine on that synapse. And this helps in ADHD symptoms, like it helps to focus attention. So this also points to the role of dopamine in focusing attention. That's still another thing, right? And so this is a drug like medicine. But there are other drugs like amphetamine or cocaine, which they act a little differently. They stimulate the system to produce dopamine. And of course, they act as drugs of, recreational drugs, so to say, where they give you the high, the pleasure, right? So this is not about focusing of attention, of course. Okay, so this is the dopamine part, the brain part, so to say. But we also, we of course want to understand the connection of this with behavior, right? And so on the behavior part, we have decision-making, risk-taking, so mechanisms that, allow us to function in the world, to control the world somehow. And we should remember that psychologists use different methods to assess risk-taking tendencies or measure. Some of them are just questionnaires, like there's this stimulating versus instrumental risk-taking inventory by Zaleszkiewicz, so our colleague actually. And we should remember this questionnaire distinguishes between risks that are taken as instrumental, like you're a firefighter, or a policeman. So it's part of your job to take these risks, right? It's instrumental to perform this job, so that you take risks. But there are also so-called stimulating risks, like, you know, when you gamble, or where you climb a skyscraper to take a selfie without any, you know, harness, so to say. You're exposing yourself to extreme risks, and but without, you know, any instrumental value, but it's just pleasure for you, right? Yeah. So we can assume that dopamine system is somehow involved in that. So of course, one way is to ask people through questionnaires what they want in different domains, what risks they are willing to take. But another way of assessing or measuring risk-taking tendencies is by giving them tasks, such as, for example, Iowa gambling task. This is a famous task from the 1990s, which Antonio Wichary and Antonio Damasio used to check how the feeling of riskiness, say, or realization that something is risky develops over time. So they gave people about 100 trials of such a task, where you had 4 decks of cards, and you had to draw the cards from the 4 decks, and 2 of them were bad decks, so they made you lose money on the long term, and 2 of them were good decks, they made you earn money. And Wichary and Damasio wanted to see how over time, across this performance of this task, the behavior changed. So if we adapt to the riskiness, if we can see, if we can realize that some of these decks are bad or good, and we see that on this graph, these are blocks of the task. The proportion of good decks chosen increased across the task, and the proportion of bad decks decreased. So this is one way of checking how people approach risk. There are even simpler tasks, such as the devil task, even from the 1960s. It's basically a simple task where you open boxes, and there's usually a reward. But in one of the boxes, there's a devil that makes you lose all the money that you collected so far. Right. So this is the risk, that you encounter the devil and lose everything that you collected so far. And another task that has the same structure is the so-called BART task, Balloon Analog Risk Task, quite recent, before 20 years ago, where you pump a balloon on a computer screen by pressing a button on the keyboard, and each pump earns you, say, a cent, and then you can stop pumping and put this money that you collected to the bank, or you can continue pumping, but then you're risking that the balloon will burst. Right, so a very simple task that tries to catch this, you know, the tension between the hope of getting more reward and versus the fear of losing the entire reward. And this task is very popular now. It's used in many studies. And so one of these studies is about the brain mechanism, or the fMRI correlates of performance of this task. And you can see on this slide that there are several brain parts associated with voluntarily taking risks on this task, so pumping that balloon. And 2 of them on the left side, so mesencephalon, so midbrain, and then striatum, ventral and dorsal, are the ones interesting for us, right? The ones that are on the dopaminergic pathway. So we see they are active. So this is the thing here, midbrain and striatum. Here, striatum. But there are also other ones which don't act as these kind of drivers, so to say, but probably act as brakes, and we'll talk about them at the end. So, but for sure, these dopaminergic pathways are associated with behavior on this task. What we also know about the connection between risk and dopamine is it comes from studies of Parkinson's disease patients. Of these patients, or actually most of them, they are given L-Dopa, which is a precursor of dopamine. But in some of the patients, what develops is there are symptoms where risk-taking symptoms, so to say. They start to, for example, drive too fast, or they start to gamble, or they start to compulsively buy stuff, spend a lot of money or on stuff. They are sexually promiscuous. So of course it happens only in some patients, but it does happen that administering patients dopamine leads to this unnecessary or side effects. And so the question is, well, always, of course, who is affected by that? So there is research on that. And there was a study, for example, that looked at the polymorphism, so variant or variability in the receptor, dopamine receptor D4, so in the gene for that receptor. And the study showed that, well, people who differ in that gene, and when they are given L-DOPA, so some of them, like people who have certain variant, they responded with increased risk-taking on a devil task, right? So there was an interaction between some genetic predisposition and the drug. So this is also another confirmation that dopaminergic system is involved in risk-taking. Another study comes, another similar result comes from studies involving presenting erotic pictures and then looking how it affects risk-taking in a very simple paradigm. And well, this was an fMRI task, so the task, it was an fMRI study, so the task had to be very simple. And so what the authors found is that what mediates the effect of the picture on the risk-taking is the activation actually in the ventral striatum in nucleus accumbens. So this is another piece of evidence that shows that this part of the brain is important both for for reward and also risk-taking, right? So this is the connection between the two. Any questions so far? Okay, so this is maybe the hottest stuff today, but we can no, actually no, because there's more. There are testers there. So because we have the question is what is connected to this pathway, to these pathways, to this system, right? So of course, there are several other systems in the human brain and body that are influence this, but I think the most relevant for us is the steroid hormones, the gonadal steroid hormones, and particularly testosterone, which is a hormone secreted by testes, but also by ovaries in women, and also adrenal glands. So women all have testosterone levels which are 8 times lower than in men, but they still have them. And of course, that hormone is usually it's necessary for, it stimulates sperm production and muscle growth, and also development of sex characteristics, which these are the things that the third thing is that happens, something that happens intensively in adolescence, actually, right? So the hormone is actually useful for, developing the sex characteristics. But it also, it connects to the brain, to different parts of the brain via androgen receptors. And we know from research, well, this is from rats, we know that if we administer a testosterone intranasally to a rat, then we know that it increases dopamine levels in nucleus accumbens, right? So we can measure that there is effect of administration of this molecule on dopamine level exactly in that part that is interesting to us, nucleus accumbens. I mean, this is pretty complex, but in generally, this graph shows that there is the increase, depending on the dose, the increase has different dynamics, right? What is also important is that, so dopamine increases, but we can also see that testosterone administration in animals, in birds, so in nature, we can observe the effect of administration of testosterone on behavior and on the effects of the behavior. So we can see that in red grouse, when we administer testosterone in some pellets, the male birds tend to increase their territory, right? So it results in increases in territory. In a sharp-tailed grouse, this effect is absent on territory, but we observe that the males are more aggressive, right? So they can defend the territory that they have better. So this is in some effects in animals, and there is some evidence on the link between testosterone and risk-taking in humans. Some of it comes from very interesting naturalistic studies from London Stock Exchange, for example. So there was one of the researchers used to be a stockbroker on London Stock Exchange, and he got interested in neuroeconomics. And what he did, he contacted stockbrokers in London, and he measured the testosterone levels both in the evening, like at 11 a.m. and in the morning, and in the evening. And he also looked at the so-called profit and loss index. So this is how much money they make during the day. And the ones who had high testosterone level in the morning made more money during that day, right? So there was a correlation between testosterone level and performance on the stock exchange. So this is a link, of endogenous measured testosterone level with risk-taking. And another evidence comes from Iowa gambling test, which I have presented to you. This is on the y-axis, we have the percentage of advantageous decks in that task. So you see that it grows. People learn to select the advantageous decks over time. Actually, it grows quite sharply in the beginning, and there's a plateau. And we can see on the left side, we have women. On the right side, we have men. And the red line shows people who are low in testosterone, and the blue line shows people who are high in testosterone, measured, so endogenous levels. And you can see that they differ. So people with lower testosterone levels, both males and females, they have higher percentage of the advantageous decks. So the people with higher testosterone level, they have a lower percentage of advantageous decks. That means they are more risk-taking, right? So this is a link between endogenous testosterone level in both sexes, actually. So that's quite important. And another piece of evidence comes from a study where testosterone was administered to women. That study is reportedly only women, results on women. And here we have on the y-axis actually the percentage of disadvantageous decks. So the reverse from what we had before. So that's why the line is dropping. But we can also see the change, right? So the percentage decreases across the blocks of the task. But we can see that there is from the third block to the fifth block, it starts to increase again, but only in not only, but more so in women who were administered testosterone versus the group with placebo. So it's kind of causal evidence that testosterone affects risk-taking. Right? A question from Gustav.
Yes, so this was a question that is about one of the things that you've talked about before, about dopamine in the brain and the areas that are active.
Mm-hmm.
Just one other point, if you still want more, like some Q&A. I'm not sure how long the presentation is.
Actually, I'm talking quite fast, so I think there will be time for talking at the end.
Okay,
right?
Okay. So the question I had is between voluntary risk-taking and risk-taking where or reward when there isn't risk involved. You just have an opportunity for reward, you seek it out, get the reward, versus there's a risk, you make a voluntary choice to take that risk because of the reward. Are there like very different patterns in the brain? Is it one is more about activation around the nuclei that are associated to dopamine and to pleasure versus the other, which is more cortical, more in the striatum, more in the ventral medial circuits, let's say? Is there a big difference like that?
I mean, you're probably referring to that first fMRI slide that I showed, right? Voluntary versus involuntary. I mean, we have to remember that this is the logic of fMRI experiments, right? Where you always compare different conditions, like a condition that is very similar to what you're interested in, but one thing differs, right? So that voluntary versus involuntary condition was that in the involuntary conditions, you looked at the balloon being pumped by by the computer. So there was only looking involved, and so the activation was only related to how you perceive the risk. But in the voluntary condition, it was you who were pressing the button. Right?
If an experiment were more about just finding a reward when there's no risk, would you expect the differences to appear more on the level of just basic pleasure, so whatever nuclei are associated to that? While if it's more of a decision-making paradigm where you do have to make a calculated risk decision, then it becomes more cortical.
I don't know. We have to talk about it later. I think it involves some discussion. I think. Yeah, but a good question, of course. Yeah. Okay, so let me just finish this basic stuff, and then of course we can talk about that later. Okay, so any questions about the testosterone levels and stuff like that? So okay, we have evidence that testosterone influences risk behavior, right? And so now we can safely move to the adolescent brain because this what we saw is all relevant to understanding the adolescent brain. So as I said, I only tried to reconstruct this knowledge via papers of Evelyn Krohn. So of course, there's probably other researchers whose views might differ, but I just wanted to reconstruct our collaborator for this project. And so what you can read there in this great papers is that adolescence is a period of increased risk-taking. I mean, we know that from epidemiological evidence like traffic accidents, crime rate, substance abuse, we know that there's an increase of that in adolescence, right? And as far as evidence for the behavior, experimental evidence for behavior, like in the lab, goes, there are mixed views. So there is a view, and some papers pointed out that there is a decrease from childhood to adulthood in the propensity for risk taking. So like a stable decrease. But other papers, and among them the Evelyn Krohn papers from her lab, show that there's a peak in risk taking in adolescents, right? So for example, we have that study by Brahms et al. Where we have this curve, and I think we should be looking at such curves in our project more, right? So what happens across the age from, let's say, age of 10 to age 20 or 25? And we see that on the y-axis, we have the number of explosions in the bite. So one of the measures from this task, how many times the balloon exploded, right? And so the data from several different so-called sub-studies, I would say, show that there's this peak. I mean, this is a curvilinear relation. So it increases from age 10 to about like 17 or 18, and then it starts to kind of drop a little bit. Maybe not sharply, but still there is a drop. So this is a curvilinear relation between a behavioral measure of risk taking and age, right? Maybe this is something that we should remember. And of course, the question is, well, why is that? What are the mechanisms behind the change in risk-taking propensity? And so one path of explaining this is by looking at the purely cognitive explanations, like cognitive control, right? So the mechanism here would be, well, there's a cognitive control is developing. And so that's why, and all adolescents are, not fully developed, so their cognitive control is not fully developed and so on. But the problem here is that adolescents perform already quite well on cognitive control tasks. So almost like adults are equally, actually the peak in many so-called fluid abilities, like fluid intelligence and related tasks like working memory tasks and so on, the peak is around 19 years of age, and later it drops. So cognitive control is not a good explanation because adolescents are pretty good already. So what Evelyn Krohn is proposing is that there are affective and motivational mechanisms at play that are better at explaining this. And so there is a biological view of the adolescent brain, right? So the view is basically that risk-taking is in adolescence is the result of an overreactive reward system in the brain. So the system that we talked about, right? The dopaminergic system that is subserving the reward seeking. And what is more important, or also important, is that At least partly, this is due to the influence of the gonadal steroid hormones, mainly testosterone. And so this is a hypothesis, but it can be supported by such findings like here, where we have the curves of increase of testosterone from age 10 to 25, or increase or will decrease as well. And we should look at the bottom. These are smooth curves from a fitted model, and we see that the blue line is for males, and the red line is for females, women. And we see that in both males and females there's an increase, but this increase is much bigger for males, and it increases until like early 20s, and then it starts to drop a little in males. Right. So this is a very strong evidence that there is some really big change on the biology side, right? And so the question is there any parallel process in the brain that relevant for our research that kind of parallels, that mimics this? And well, we can look at the reactivity of the ventral striatum, so of the nucleus accumbens, really. So sometimes if you read the literature on fMRI studies on reward, you will encounter the term ventral striatum. But what neuroscientists usually understand is that this is about the nucleus accumbens. Sometimes the reviewers are fussy about when you say that there is an activation of nucleus accumbens, because the blob that you see on the fMRI image is actually bigger than this structure, right? Because of the kind of the method, of the intricacies of the method. So the reviewers say, well, you shouldn't say this is nucleus accumbens, say ventral striatum only, right? So that's why sometimes you see in a paper a ventral striatum, but what is usually meant by the authors is that it's nucleus accumbens, which is part of ventral striatum. So you can see that there is a curvilinear relation between age and reactivity of this structure to winning. So if you have a simple monetary gamble where you can win or lose the same amount of money, right? And you win the money, you win 3 euros, for example. Yeah. And of course, in fMRI, you always compare the responses to the winning to something else, like the responses to the losing, right? So what we see is the blob, the fMRI blob, is the difference between responding to the winning versus responding to the losing. And you can see that this response, this reactivity to such situations, so it shows such curvilinear relationship with age. I mean, there is a peak at around 13 years of age. There's a little drop at 14, and there's a peak again at 16 years of age, right? So and then it drops again until like 17 and 18. So this is I think an important insight from neuroscience, that there is a brain mechanism that shows this relationship with age, which kind of mimics the behavioral relation with the relation with the behavioral measure, with the risk taking on the BART's task, but also it's parallel to somewhat parallel to the increases of to the changes of testosterone level. So this is more like indirect evidence for supporting this view of the adolescent brain. And there is more direct evidence showing that the volume in boys, it's the volume of the orbitofrontal cortex. In girls, it's the it's all about the volume in both sexes, but the relation is different, right? So in boys, it is the smaller volume, and in girls, it's the larger volume of the orbitofrontal cortex. And this is what leads to more risk take, right? And we remember that orbitofrontal cortex is the cortex close that is first, so to say, hit by the dopaminergic pathway, right? So, and it's been associated with valuation, with giving value to stimuli across many different studies. So we know that this is the part of the brain that is responding to rewards. So, and it's related to risk taking in adolescence. We know that. And there's a finding relating both testosterone levels and orbitofrontal cortex to the performance on the bar task. So there's some mediation between. So there's an effect of testosterone. Actually, it's significant in girls, but not in boys. The direct one, but there's a mediation of that relation through the volume, gray matter volume of the orbitofrontal cortex in boys, or the surface area of this part of the brain in girls. So this is a mediator of the relation of testosterone on risk taking. So the both are involved, the hormone and the part of the brain that is responsive to risk taking. Okay, and the last finding from the brain studies on adolescents, I think a little bit even more relevant to us, is from a study by Chen et al. And this is relevant to our project, I think, for one more reason, because it involves other people. So there is an adolescent performing, or an adult or young adult performing a task where they have to. This is a simulation of driving, and they have to stop on the red light. So they have to press the pedal to brake, right, when they see a red light in that simulation. And of course, sometimes, for most of the time, people do stop, but sometimes they push the gas pedal, right? So they don't stop. And so these are the risky decisions when instead of braking, you push the gas pedal. So percent of risky decisions is the highest in adolescents, but there's an additional experimental manipulation. You could perform this task alone or in company of a peer. So next to you could be sitting a peer, another adolescent or another adult, and so that's the red bar in the top graph. So when there's a peer involved, there's the percentage of the risky decisions is much higher in adolescents in that situation compared to the situation when they are performing this alone, right? So there's a behavior and also so of course there's the brain that's kind of subserving this behavior, but there's also the social influence of that, right? And the analysis of the brain. So this was performed also in a fMRI scanner, and so on the bottom graph we can see the signal change. So some relative increase of the signal in ventral striatum. So in nucleus accumbens probably. When this is happening, when there's a go response, right? And we see that this change is highest in adolescents, right? So we can assume that they are getting pleasure from that pushing that button, right? So there's some reward involved in this behavior, in this risky behavior, right? But this is only in adolescents. In young adults, I mean, and of course this response is higher in the go response versus the stop response, and you cannot see this relation in the other two groups, in young adults or adults, right? So this is a particularly and another part that is mediating this, apart from ventral striatum, another part of the brain that is mediating this behavioral effects is the orbitofrontal cortex. So another culprit in our story that's subserving the risk taking. Yeah, so this is a particularly nice study combining the brain mechanism and behavior and also the social world, so to say, that is affecting the behavior. Okay, I'm close to the end. Oh no, yeah, the question is, how much time do we have?
We have like 14 minutes for Q&A if you would stop here, but
no, but I still have some slides about braking, right? Because the question is, is there hope? Like, when we have this tendency to take risks, like, is there anything in our brain that can kind of stop us, right? So as I mentioned, there are parts who can be treated as kind of engines, like the striatum, midbrain, so which are involved in risk taking and reward seeking. But there are also parts of the brain that can be treated as kind of brakes or kind of warning, maybe warning centers, so to say. And these parts are particularly anterior cingulate cortex and insular cortex. And I think Manos can have a lot to say about insula, because insula is involved in interoception. And this is also important in our context. So these two parts, they usually act together. They are activated together. But anterior cingulate is particularly interesting. Many different studies showed that this part of the responds to events that have negative utility to us. And this is a very broad collection of things like painful stimuli, cognitive conflict, cognitive effort, but also social rejection, right? When you are playing a game where, for example, cyberball game where you can be rejected, there's a response in anterior cingulate. So anything that is signaling negative consequences for you is, so to say, coded in that part, right? That part responds to. So this is there's evidence that this part is involved in encoding negative utility, and this nicely is corroborated by results from Iowa gambling task from that seminal study by Wichary and Damasio. They showed, in addition to the behavioral effects of the trial of the task, right? So the people learn from trial to trial. They showed that one measure, namely skin conductance, so the measure of how much your palms are sweating, right? You are sweating. We are usually sweating when we are nervous, right? And so this can be quantified by skin conductance, by measuring the conductance of electrical current by your skin. And so here you have an example of the recorded signal of skin conductance across the task. This is actually from my research, where people make decisions across about 50 trials. So there are these peaks, right, bumps, and so this is most of the time it's associated with some stimulus, but sometimes it's spontaneous. In the HARA task, they looked at the so-called anticipatory skin conductance responses. So the peaks preceding the behavior of picking a card, right? So what happens before I pick a card? And they looked at these anticipatory SCRs, and you can see that. So this is the bottom slide. Bottom figure. So you can see that for the bad decks, when people reached for the card from a bad deck, these SCRs increased, and already in the second block of the task, they were very high. So we know that this is even before. That was another measure, a self-report measure, if people are aware which decks are good or bad. And this response of the skin conductance, it preceded the awareness of, on this task, right? So the emotional response was there, and it drove the behavior, because we can see that in the behavioral responses on the second block, people were already increasing advantages blocks, choices from the advantages blocks, but still we're not aware of the relation between their behavior and the decks. But the skin conductance is somewhat new already, and we know from other research, mostly by Hugo Critchley, and Manos, I think you also have to say something, right? You collaborated with Hugo Critchley, yeah? He did a lot of great stuff on looking at the brain mechanism. You can pinpoint the correlates of the brain correlates of skin conductance are actually in the anterior cingulate cortex, right? So we know that this is an index of what's happening there in that part, right? So this is a kind of indirect evidence showing the involvement of anterior cingulate cortex in kind of warning us against bad decisions. So this is one thing, and the other thing comes from a really cool study that I really like, because it's like the core of neuroeconomics. And this is a study where the authors tried to recreate financial bubbles in a laboratory. So they had like a mini financial market where 30 people were trading stocks, and one or two of them was put in a scanner and was performing this task when doing an fMRI scan. And so they try to recreate financial bubbles when the price of a stock increases and then suddenly it drops. So there's a bubble and crash. And you can see on the right side, on the top graph, they had different sessions, and in most of them there was this sharp rise and then fall of stock price. And so they were interested who makes most money in these conditions when there's a crash. So there's a negative event kind of looming, and then it's happened. And they looked at activations both in the nucleus accumbens, in ventral striatum, and in insula. So another brain part which is responsive to negative stimuli and also responsive to interoceptive stimuli. And the left graph shows you it's kind of complex on the x-axis, but it basically shows you the activations in that part and the correlation of the activations in that part with the buying behavior. So if that correlation is strong, it means that people use the signal from the nucleus accumbens to guide their behavior, to buy the stocks. And people who did that, they were losing money, actually. I mean, so they were earning less than people who were not exhibiting that relation, right? And on the right side, you have the insula. So on the x-axis, there is a correlation between, or probability of selling a stock if you have a signal in insula. And so these people were having this relation to a higher degree, they were earning more money. So this in this condition of the crash, right? So you can say, well, that insula here is played a role of a kind of warning signal, right? Deliverer of the warning signal, and on the other hand, people who relied on what was happening in the nucleus accumbens, they were so to say doomed to lose money, right? So this is another nice evidence of the involvement of these two parts of the brain in different process, right? In the promoting reward seeking and promoting kind of caution. Okay, so I think this is the last slide about the breaks, and I think that to sum it up, you can say, well, I mean, there's of course ongoing research, and more research is needed to disentangle all this. But we can say that there are some pathways in the brain that act as engines that drives us towards reward seeking and also risk taking. And luckily there are other parts that can help us to break a little, so to pause and withhold these relations, these responses. And we know that hormonal influences on these systems add another layer of neuromodulation. So the change in hormone levels might probably change also how these systems function. And this is relevant for understanding what happens in adolescence. And of course, this is relevant for understanding why we sometimes make bad decisions and what can help us out of that. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Celine's got to monitor the chat in case any questions from outside online. Do you have any questions here? If not, I'm happy to start with a question. Super interesting research. I think there is a super nice summary of the development, more or less, the brain development. One question I think that we also ask a lot is, how do you then translate those brain developments and the risk-taking, risk-seeking behavior to the political development of adolescents? So what type of risky behavior, risk-seeking behavior does this relate to in research in adolescent politics, for example?
Yeah, of course, that's a big question for the whole for the whole team, to translate. But one particular pathway can be to radicalism, for example. Right, we are studying radicalism, work package 6. And actually, with Anna, we were discussing a lot of the possible underlying mechanism of radicalism. And I even have a so-called dopamine hypothesis of radicalism that we try to coin. You can understand that, you can say that one of the outcomes of adolescence can be radicalism, right? Radical behavior, like radical political behavior. And so you would like to know why this happens, right? And of course, there's much more than only the brain. There's the narratives and networks, but you can also look at it from the biological side. What kind of makes people to become radical, except the network and the narrative, right? So some of the answers might be what I talked about.
Can I say something on that?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm novice, so excuse my comment if it's not relative, but I was interested also in the example you gave about risk behavior in adolescence with the going through the red light story. And I was thinking, looking at this, that our question whether adolescents should vote.
Exactly.
If you see that doing it with others, you are taking a risky behavior, and then young adults don't have the same pattern, and it comes back again with adults. But my question from a social psychological point of view is, what is risky behavior in voting? Some people would say voting far right is a risky behavior. Some people would say voting far left is a risky behavior.
Maybe voting far, from the middle.
Or not voting at all. Or, deciding that this is crap politics and I won't be interested.
I mean, of course, this is again the question to the political scientists. But I think anything that is, here in this context, the risky behavior is risk taking is understood as kind of crossing some boundary, right? Or increasing the chances that you will lose stuff, right? That you had times before. Yeah. So how voting?
I don't want to monopolize, but I was thinking of the future of democracy in that respect. So people are taking risks in adolescence for whatever mechanism you have underlined, and they're taking the risk when they are with others. So peers are important in this situation. And if we are looking about voting behavior or interest in politics or the future of democracy, that's questions that we have to perhaps discuss from an interdisciplinary point of view.
Yeah, and I think that neuroscience brings some important insights for such a question about the voting. Right?
Yeah, no. I agree with you. I just wanted to point it out.
Okay. Yeah, since we don't have that much time left, I think we can also ask some more questions after the presentation. I think Sabine is going to lead out one for us before the chat.
Yeah, that's one question from Diamantis. So this was a very interesting talk. Thank you. My question is about the relationship between the developmental trajectory of the risk-taking and that of ideology. Do you think that studying the development of these brain regions of interest, NACC, insula, can help us understand how ideology matures?
I think so, but I also thought today, so I think the answer is yes, but I think it requires that we explicitly look at different developmental curves. And maybe we should organize a session where we will have different curves of the development of political attitudes, risk-taking, brain stuff, and you can just look at them and see maybe there are some parallels, some differences, right? Because I don't know anything about developmental of political attitudes. I would first have to look at how this looks across development. Maybe that's what we should do, right? And in some session. But I would, of course, my answer would be yes. It's somehow the brain development is of course relevant. We just have to find the link through the behavioral studies and so on. So we have to link these levels carefully by putting together evidence from different disciplines.
Thank you very much again. Close the online session. It is tradition in the lab that the speaker gets a hot politics mug from us. Unfortunately, we've left this mug in Amsterdam. I hope this cue that you will receive a mug in the next few weeks in order to raise your dopamine levels. Next week, we will not have a session. And the week after that, we are back with a session from Amsterdam. And it's going to be Josefine Magnussen from the University of Gothenburg on the influence of out particles on citizens' attitude formation.